The sugar sparkled, but it wasn't sweet. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me where you're listening from. I love seeing this mystery-loving community grow. Your comments always bring warmth to the coldest crimes. Let's begin. It was one of those October mornings when New York's gray skies looked like they'd been freshly scrubbed with dishwater and left to dry crooked. I had just poured my second cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. Not the kind of event that usually shakes the walls of the brownstone, but given Wolfe's feelings about uninvited visitors, it might as well have been a siege. Fritz was in the kitchen, humming something Viennese and beating egg whites into submission, so I went to the door. A delivery man stood there, holding a wooden crate the size of a small coffin, marked perishable, handle with care. "Mr. Wolfe?" he asked. "Last I checked," I said. "He still answers to that name, though you'll get no answer from him in person before noon." He shrugged, thrust a clipboard toward me and said, "Sign here." Now, Wolfe doesn't accept deliveries he hasn't ordered. The rule's about as flexible as the 10 Commandments. So when I saw Wolfe Gourmet Imports, Sugar, Barbados No. 9 written across the label, I figured it was something Fritz had ordered for his pantry ambitions. Fritz collects rare ingredients the way some men collect sins, quietly, joyfully, and without remorse. The crate was heavy, too heavy for sugar unless the good folks in Barbados had started packing it with guilt. I lugged it into the kitchen where Fritz stopped mid-whisk and blinked like I'd brought in a live bear. "I ordered no sugar," he said, wiping his hands. "Not this month." "Then maybe it's from one of your secret admirers," I said. He scowled, pried open the lid with a knife, and the sweet smell that came out wasn't sugar. It was something else. Something faintly metallic, like rusted tin and forgotten basements. Inside were neat layers of white cloth bags, each labeled Pure Cane. Fritz took one, untied it, dipped his fingers in, and frowned. "This is not sugar," he said. Wolfe's voice came from behind me. "Archie, what is that infernal noise of splitting wood?" I turned to see him filling the doorway, yellow silk robe, face like a thundercloud of intellect. "Delivery, boss? Sugar. Only it isn't." He came forward 2 slow steps, nostrils flaring. Wolfe never moves quickly unless food's in immediate danger, which, come to think of it, might have been the case here. He plucked a pinch from Fritz's hand, examined it like a jeweler would a flawed diamond, then rubbed it between thumb and forefinger. "It is not sugar," he agreed. "Nor salt, nor flour. It is foreign." "Maybe sand from a beach in Barbados," I offered. "Souvenir packaging." "Phooey." He turned toward the globe of orchids in the corner as if it might share his outrage. "Sand does not carry the scent of phosphorus." I gave him my best curious eyebrow. "Phosphorus? Indeed. Fritz, do not touch another grain. Archie, find out who sent this." "Whoever it was," I said. "They paid a lot to make your kitchen smell like a chemistry set." Wolfe grunted. "And that, Archie, is precisely what disturbs me." By noon, the crate had been moved to the basement with tongs. Wolfe had refused both breakfast and conversation, and the phone had rung twice. Once from the delivery service, once from a woman whose voice could have melted the ice on Fifth Avenue. She asked for Nero Wolfe in a tone that sounded more like a confession than a request. When I told Wolfe, he didn't even lift an eyebrow. "Archie," he said, "invite her to call again at 4:30. I shall be prepared then, and for heaven's sake, see that no one disturbs Fritz's pantry further. I have a suspicion we have received more than sugar." And that was how it started. With a box that wasn't sugar, a voice that trembled over the telephone line, and a man who never leaves his house, preparing, unwillingly, to do battle with the outside world. By 4:30, the brownstone had the kind of hush that always meant Wolfe was thinking. Not his usual mild brooding, the sort that went with orchids and beer, but the deep variety, when he folds in on himself like a closing flower, and every movement from him is an event. I had spent the hours in between arranging the drawing room, keeping the delivery crate sealed downstairs, and calling the shipping company. They had as much idea where that crate came from as a pigeon would about who owns the park it struts in. At precisely 4:31, the doorbell chimed again. I opened the door to a woman whose presence immediately rearranged the atmosphere. She was in her early 30s, tall, coat the color of dried blood, and a face that had done its share of thinking. Not the fragile sort of beauty that begs for sympathy. This was the kind that took it without asking. Her gloves were still on when she said, "I'm here to see Mr. Wolfe." I stepped aside. "You and half of New York, lady, but you've got better odds. He's expecting you." Inside, she took in the hallway with one slow sweep of her eyes, the way people do when they're not sure if they're walking into a home or a trap. When we entered the office, Wolfe didn't rise. Of course he didn't, but his head tilted the slightest fraction, which in his language is the equivalent of a handshake and a back slap. "Miss," he began. "Karen," she said. "Ellen Karen. Thank you for seeing me." "Not at all," Wolfe said. "You called concerning an importation issue." She nodded, sat down on the red leather chair opposite his desk, and folded her gloves on her lap like a schoolgirl trying to look proper while her mind staged a mutiny. "That crate that arrived this morning," she said. "I believe it was meant for me." That got Wolfe's eyes open a millimeter wider. "Indeed? The address bore my name, not yours." "I sent it that way deliberately." She leaned forward. "Because I didn't trust it to arrive safely otherwise." I took a step closer to the desk. "You sent something dangerous to Wolfe's kitchen as a favor to yourself?" She flinched, then looked at me squarely. "Mr. Goodwin, I didn't know what else to do. I work for Ainsley and March, import brokers for gourmet goods. We handle everything from Ceylon cinnamon to Peruvian cacao. Last week, one of our warehouses in Newark was broken into. Nothing major went missing, officially. But that shipment, the one labeled Barbados No. 9, it wasn't sugar at all. It was a compound, experimental, unregistered, and, according to the client, highly profitable." "Profitable," Wolfe echoed softly, "but not edible, I assume." "No," she said. "Industrial. Some sort of chemical derivative. The client called it a sweetener substitute, but it's nothing I've ever seen before. I discovered the discrepancy and confronted my employer. 2 days later, someone tried to run me off the road. Yesterday, I found my apartment door open and my desk at work empty. All my records gone." She paused, the words clinging to the air like fog. "So I shipped the last crate I could get my hands on, to you, because I knew Nero Wolfe's name was the one no one would dare tamper with. If anyone could uncover what's really in it, it's you." Wolfe's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness sharpened. "Miss Karen, what precisely do you believe this substance to be?" "I think," she said quietly, "it's an industrial byproduct that someone is selling as food-grade sugar to undercut tariffs. If that's true, it could poison thousands." Fritz made a faint noise from the hallway, something between a gasp and a prayer. Wolfe raised one hand to calm him, his eyes fixed on the woman. "And your employers, Ainsley and March, do they share your alarm?" Her lips twisted. "They share my silence. I've been suspended without pay." I couldn't help but whistle softly. "So you've got a box of mystery powder, a company that's suddenly allergic to your existence, and a hit-and-run artist who thinks you've talked too much. That about it?" She nodded. "And I don't know who I can trust." Wolfe leaned back, fingers forming a steeple. "Miss Karen, trust is an extravagance. I recommend prudence instead. Archie, retrieve the delivery manifest from the crate and prepare a list of every contact this woman has had regarding the shipment. Names, times, and affiliations. We shall begin there." When she left 20 minutes later, the brownstone's air felt charged. Wolfe didn't speak until the front door had clicked shut. "Archie, call Inspector Kramer. Tell him to come at his convenience, which will mean immediately." "That's generous of you," I said. "You planning to share the sugar with him?" He frowned. If my conjecture is correct, he may soon wish he'd taken his coffee without. I went to the phone. Kramer, as expected, answered with the warmth of a steam drill. When I told him Wolfe had something chemical, possibly criminal, definitely confidential, he said he'd be there within the hour. While we waited, I went downstairs to the basement. The crate sat on the workbench under the single bulb, innocent as a Sunday picnic. I sliced open another bag carefully and held it to the light. The grains shimmered faintly, not the way sugar catches light, but with a pearly sheen, slick like ground glass. Then I saw it, etched faintly along the inside of the bag. Lot 47B, Orpheum Foods. When I brought that up to Wolfe, his eyes glinted. "Orpheum Foods," he said. "Archie, that name has surfaced twice in the past year in reports concerning tariff evasion and adulterated imports. A large enterprise, protected by obscurity and influence. If Miss Karen's suspicion is accurate, we stand not at the fringe of commerce, but in its shadow." "That shadow has claws," I said. "Somebody tried to kill her for poking it." "Precisely," Wolfe murmured. "And now they may turn their attention here." "Which means," I said, "we can expect company." "Undoubtedly. Fritz will not open the door for anyone unannounced. I will see no one after dinner, and, Archie, do not taste that powder again. Not even as a jest. I didn't plan to. I like my tongue unpoisoned." The bell rang again before he could answer. This time it wasn't Kramer. It was a young man in a gray suit, slick hair, and a grin too confident for the hour. He held an envelope and spoke with the kind of politeness that smells of cologne and threat. "For Mr. Wolfe," he said. "Personal." I took it, and before I could ask his name, he was already descending the steps, disappearing into the drizzle. The envelope was unmarked. Inside, a single sheet of paper read, "You have something that does not belong to you. Return it. Tonight." Wolfe read it twice, then set it down as if it were an undercooked egg. "Well, Archie," he said finally, "our guests have announced themselves. Let us oblige them with preparation." That was Nero Wolfe for batten the hatches and ready the guns. Only his guns were words, logic, and a voice that could reduce liars to dust. And if I'd learned anything from living under that roof, it was this. When someone threatens the brownstone, it isn't the walls that fight back. It's Wolfe himself, immovable and inevitable as reason. Kramer arrived at 6, looking like he'd just been told the city's coffee supply was poisoned, which, given the circumstances, wasn't far from the truth. He stomped into the office, dropped his hat on the edge of Wolfe's desk, and glared at both of us like he was trying to decide which of us to blame first. "All right, Wolfe," he growled. "You said you had something chemical, criminal and confidential. I'm here. Start talking." Wolfe didn't look up from his chair. "Good evening, Inspector. I'm gratified by your promptness." Kramer puffed. "Yeah, you're gratified. I'm out 2 men watching a warehouse fire in Brooklyn, and you drag me up here for a science experiment. Make it good." I handed him the anonymous note. He read it once, scowled, and said, "You get a lot of fan mail like this, Wolfe." "Rarely," Wolfe replied. "My admirers usually prefer anonymity without hostility. This one demonstrates both." Kramer grunted. "So what's this all about?" I explained, quickly, the story of the crate, Miss Karen, and the mystery powder. By the time I reached the part about Orpheum Foods and the warning note, Kramer's cigar was chewed almost in half. "Sweetener substitute," he repeated. "You think this stuff's poison?" "Possibly not in small quantities," Wolfe said. "But it is not sugar, nor anything fit for consumption. If distributed through ordinary channels as an edible commodity, it could result in considerable discomfort for the unsuspecting." "Discomfort," Kramer echoed. You mean corpses? Wolfe inclined his head a fraction. Potentially. That sobered the room. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like it had gained a conscience. All right, Kramer said. We'll send a sample to the lab. I would advise against that, Wolfe said mildly. At least not until you've ensured the sample is untraceable to this house. If Orpheum Foods or their affiliates learn that we possess evidence, they may attempt retrieval. Kramer scowled again, which for him is practically a handshake. You got yourself into this, Wolfe. You better not be holding back anything. I hold back only my dinner, Wolfe said, and I intend to remedy that soon. Goodwin will provide you with Miss Karen's statement and the manifest. After Kramer left, the tension in the air stayed behind like uninvited smoke. Wolfe stared into the fireplace without lighting it, his mind obviously busy with calculations I couldn't see. Finally, he said, Archie, the note's tone suggests immediacy, but not desperation. Its author expects compliance without confrontation. That arrogance is instructive. Meaning, he said, that they do not expect resistance. We shall disappoint them. At that, the phone rang. I crossed to it, half expecting another ghost caller. Instead, a crisp male voice said, This is Ainsley and March. Is Mr. Wolfe available? I told him Wolfe was occupied but listening, which was true enough. My name is Martin Ainsley, the man said. I've been informed that one of my employees, Miss Ellen Caron, has involved your office in a private matter concerning a shipment. I would like to clarify that any such shipment was an internal logistical error, not a criminal one. I passed the receiver to Wolfe. Mr. Ainsley, Wolfe said smoothly, your concern is noted. However, I am not in the habit of discussing my business affairs by telephone. There's no business, sir. Only a misunderstanding. Then misunderstandings can wait until tomorrow. Good evening. He hung up before the man could reply. That, Wolfe said to me, confirms Miss Karen's story. If he were innocent, he would send an attorney, not a phone call. I nodded. You think they'll make another move tonight? They already have, he said. The note was step one. The next will be retrieval. Subtle or forceful, depending on their confidence. You will remain alert. I've heard that from him before, but this time, something in his tone carried the weight of genuine warning. I checked the locks on every window and door, then the basement. The crate was still there, untouched. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the air in the brownstone had changed. Thicker, heavier, as though someone was waiting just outside the walls. At 10, I brewed coffee. Wolfe was in his chair, eyes closed, lips moving faintly as if reciting from some internal library. Fritz had retired, convinced no one sane would want food in a house that smelled like phosphorus and threat. The silence was broken by a faint rattle from below. Not loud, but sharp enough to stand out from the creaks of old wood. I moved fast and quiet down the basement steps, flashlight in hand. The bulb swung above the crate, shadows twisting. Nothing moved, but the side door, the one that opens to the alley, was unlatched. Someone had been there. I examined the lock. It wasn't broken, just lifted neatly, like a practiced hand had worked it. There were faint smudges near the handle, oily, recent. I knelt by the crate. The lid was still nailed, but one corner had been pried slightly, barely a hairline crack. Someone had tried to open it and quit halfway. When I came back upstairs, Wolfe's eyes opened instantly. Well, somebody paid a visit, I said. Didn't take anything, but they tried. Good, Wolfe murmured. That tells us two things. 1, they know where it is. 2, they were interrupted or deterred. By what? By the awareness that I was expecting them. Archie, tomorrow you will visit Miss Karen's employer. Observe without announcing yourself. We require confirmation of motive. He reached for his beer, finally poured himself a glass, and added quietly, and bring Saul Panzer into this. We will need his discretion. By midnight, the house was locked again, and the city outside had gone to sleep under a fine, misting rain. Wolfe had retired, and I was left in the office with the smell of orchids and the soft tick of the clock marking the time between danger and discovery. Around 1, as I was shutting down for the night, I noticed the note again on Wolfe's desk. Return it. Tonight. I couldn't help thinking whoever wrote that had made one fatal assumption, that Nero Wolfe would ever obey an order delivered without reason. The next morning began like any other, except for the fact that I was walking into enemy territory with a smile and a false story about sugar imports. The rain had stopped, but the street still gleamed, and Ainsley and March's building sat on 41st like it had money in the walls and secrets in the elevators. The receptionist, a woman with sharp lipstick and a sharper tone, told me Mr. Ainsley was in meetings all morning. That was fine by me. It gave me time to wander, taking in the framed photographs of factories, the glossy certificates, the faint smell of burnt paper coming from somewhere down the hall. When I found the file room, the door was ajar. A man in shirt sleeves was inside, feeding papers into a shredder. Box after box, neat labels, import logs, Lot 47, client correspondence. I waited until he left for a smoke break, then slipped in. In the bottom of one half-empty carton, I found a receipt, Orpheum Foods, Lot 47B, quantity 250 crates, signed by Martin Ainsley himself. That little piece of paper was the bridge Wolfe wanted, between suspicion and proof. I pocketed it and headed out, but I'd barely made it to the street before I realized I wasn't alone. A gray sedan pulled from the curb and rolled along behind me. I crossed at the next light. It did the same. When I turned into the deli on 8th, the car slowed, then parked. I bought a sandwich I didn't want, watched the window reflection, and confirmed what I already knew. Whoever wanted that crate back hadn't gone home to bed. Back at the brown stone, Wolfe listened to my report without interruption. When I handed him the receipt, he examined it like a relic. "Excellent," he said finally. "Now we know their method. Industrial adulteration concealed as import substitution. The profit is vast, the risk catastrophic, and our Miss Karen has stumbled upon the truth too soon." "She's in danger," I said. "Yes," Wolfe agreed, "and by extension so are we. Therefore, we must control the board before the opponent moves again." He leaned back, fingers steepled. "Archie, invite Miss Karen here tomorrow morning, at 9. Inform her we are prepared to expose Orpheum Foods. Then prepare for company." I raised an eyebrow. "You expecting more sugar lovers?" "No," he said. "Predators." And for the first time that week, Wolfe smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that meant somewhere, someone had just lost the game without knowing it yet. The next morning began with the kind of quiet that always makes me uneasy. The brownstone was too still, too orderly, like it was holding its breath. Fritz was in the kitchen assembling breakfast, eggs, mushrooms, and a pastry that could have passed inspection in Vienna, but even his usual humming had gone, missing. Wolfe was already in the office when I came down, seated at his desk with the morning paper folded neatly beside him. He hadn't touched it. That was my first sign. Things were serious. "She's late," he said without looking up. "She's also the nervous type," I told him. "Give her 10 minutes to work up the courage to walk into a house full of logic." He made a sound that might have been amusement or indigestion. "Courage," he said, "is seldom the decisive factor in matters of intellect. Punctuality, however, is a courtesy. One must suspect either fear or interference." The word interference hung in the air like a draft from an open window. At 9:12, the doorbell rang. Fritz answered, and I heard the muffled exchange of polite greetings. But when she stepped into the office, I saw immediately that something was wrong. Ellen Karen's coat was damp, her gloves mismatched, and her face, the careful, composed face from yesterday, had cracks in it now. Not visible ones, but the kind you hear in her voice. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said. "Someone followed me." Wolfe's eyes flickered. "Here." "No," she said. "I took a taxi, then walked 3 blocks. I didn't see the car again, but I know it was there this morning when I left my building." I gestured for her to sit, and she did, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Wolfe regarded her in silence for a moment. "Miss Karen, I have no tolerance for hysteria, but I do for accuracy. Describe the car." "Dark blue sedan. Newer model. 2 men inside, one driving, the other pretending to read a newspaper." "License number?" I couldn't see. It was raining again. "Archie," Wolfe said, "inform Mr. Panzer that his morning's assignment has altered. He is to identify and follow the vehicle in question." "Right," I said, heading for the phone. I gave Saul a brief summary, color, time, and likely route. And by the time I hung up, Wolfe was already pressing Miss Karen for more details. "You brought the crate here, indirectly," he said. "Therefore you possess knowledge that the men who threaten you lack, or wish to suppress. What exactly did you discover in the company's records?" She hesitated. "I told you the shipment was listed as sugar substitute, but the chemical designation on the invoices was coded." I looked it up. "The formula isn't recognized by the Food and Drug Administration. But there's something else. 2 weeks ago, an inspector from the Department of Commerce was scheduled to review our import logs. The meeting was cancelled the day before. The inspector was found dead that night. Heart attack officially. I didn't think much of it then, but now—" She stopped. Wolfe's voice dropped to a quiet rumble. "Now you believe it was not coincidence?" She nodded. He leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Then we are dealing with a conspiracy of commerce and convenience. Profit that kills quietly is no less murder, Miss Karen." Her eyes met his. "Will you help me?" "Help you?" Wolfe said. "I already have. You're alive." I've seen Wolfe pull that one before, the way he likes to pretend he's made up his mind against something right before deciding the opposite. It's his way of testing people. She didn't flinch or plead, just stared at him like she understood the rules of his private game. That seemed to satisfy him. "Very well," he said. "We proceed." At 10:30, Saul called in. His voice was calm, professional, but the news wasn't pretty. "Your lady's right, Archie. Car's a Navy Lincoln, new plates, no registration match. 2 men, both plain clothes, probably hired muscle. They're still parked near her apartment. If they don't see her by noon, they'll move." "Move how?" I asked. "My guess? To wherever they think she went last. Your place." When I relayed that, Wolfe sighed. Not from fear, but irritation, like the universe had failed his personal code of order. "Archie," he said, "our hospitality is being abused. They must be shown the limits. You want me to call Kramer?" "Not yet. I prefer to offer them an opportunity to incriminate themselves first." Wolfe turned to Miss Karen. "You will remain here for the present. No calls, no correspondence. Fritz will see to your comfort. Archie, intercept them before they arrive. Do not engage in heroics. Observe and report." If Wolfe ever told me to be heroic, I'd start checking the thermostat in hell. I grabbed my hat and went out the back way, circling to the alley. The rain had turned to a fine mist again, New York's version of a polite warning. I waited at the corner until I saw the Lincoln slide into view, cruising slow. They parked across the street, engine idling. 2 men, just as Saul said. One thick through the neck, the other sharp-eyed, restless. They didn't come out. I jotted down the partial plate, HZ4, and ducked back before they could spot me. 10 minutes later, a courier truck pulled up in front of the brownstone. The driver got out, rang the bell, and handed Fritz a small parcel. Nothing unusual about that except for the return label. Orpheum Foods. I took it before Fritz could move. Better let me see to that. It was light, no bigger than a cigar box. I carried it to the office, set it on Wolfe's desk, and stepped back. Wolfe studied it for a full 30 seconds before he spoke. "Open it." I lifted the lid carefully. Inside was a note folded twice over, lying atop a small glass jar filled with what looked like the same pearly substance from the crate. The note read, "A taste for the truth can be fatal. Return our property, Mr. Wolfe, or the next sample will not be so harmless." Wolfe's expression did not change, but his hand went to the bell cord. "Fritz, bring the decanter. Archie, seal that jar in a separate container. Handle it as if it were nitroglycerin, which, metaphorically, it may be." I fetched one of the glass sample jars from the shelf and did as told. Wolfe sat motionless, eyes half-lidded. "They escalate," he said softly. "Their confidence is admirable but misplaced." "Should we let Kramer in now?" I asked. "Not yet. I need proof they have committed a crime, not merely an offense to civility. Tonight we bait them." "How?" "By pretending to comply." He dictated 3 short notes, to Ainsley, to Orpheum Foods, and one anonymous, to be mailed separately. Each was crafted in Wolfe's deliberate, ambiguous style, offering a hint that he might be willing to return the material under the right conditions. It was a trap set with ink and implication. When Fritz took the letters to the corner box, Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes again. "They will come tonight, Archie, and when they do, we must be ready to prove their intent." I asked the obvious question. "You expecting them to try the same door again?" "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps they will choose one less civilized. Criminals, like roaches, are adaptable." I spent the rest of the afternoon checking every latch, every blind. Miss Karen stayed in the front room, tense but steady. Wolfe, of course, refused to acknowledge the possibility of danger. He simply prepared for it with the efficiency of a chess master resetting his board. By 9 that night, the air outside was damp and cold, the kind that carries sound too easily. The city noise faded, leaving only the steady hum of traffic far away. Fritz had long gone to his quarters. Wolfe sat in his chair, eyes open now, waiting. At 10:15, a faint knock came from the back entrance, the one to the service yard. Too polite for burglars, too late for deliveries. I drew my revolver, not that Wolfe approved, but I like insurance, and moved silently through the corridor. The knock came again, firmer this time. I opened the inner door an inch. A man's voice said softly, "Mr. Wolfe?" I didn't answer. Instead, I listened. 2 sets of shoes, close together, careful. I waited another moment, then threw the bolt fast and yanked the door open. The man in front jerked back, surprise all over his face. The second one, neck like a tree trunk, stepped forward. I didn't give him time. "Evening, gentlemen. Sugar delivery's closed for the night." The tall one frowned. "We're here to collect what doesn't belong to you." "That makes us even," I said. "You're standing on property that doesn't belong to you either." He reached inside his coat, but before he could do anything foolish, a voice rolled from behind me. Smooth, deep, final. "Archie." Wolfe stood in the hall, massive and unmoving. "Invite them in." The men hesitated, glanced at each other, then stepped forward. Wolfe waited until they were framed in the doorway before saying, "Gentlemen, you bring a threat into my home. I suggest you take it back out with you unspoken." The tall one sneered. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with." "On the contrary," Wolfe said. "You are employees of Orpheum Foods, temporarily engaged in the disposal of inconveniences. You are here to retrieve evidence that implicates your employer in a criminal enterprise. Unfortunately for you, your arrival constitutes proof of precisely that." The shorter man's hand twitched, but Wolfe's voice froze him. "Archie, the camera." I swung open the panel in the wall where the new camera installation sat. Wolfe's latest concession to modernity. The flash clicked once, capturing the two of them perfectly. "That," Wolfe said, "will suffice for Kramer." The men realized too late what had happened. One cursed and lunged, but I was quicker. A shove, a twist, and he hit the floor. The other bolted through the door, vanishing into the rain. I locked it behind him. Wolfe regarded the groaning one on the floor with disdain. "He will remain until Inspector Kramer arrives. Archie, telephone him. Inform him that Orpheum's representatives have overstepped the bounds of commerce." When Kramer arrived 30 minutes later, soaked and red-faced, he took one look at the scene and muttered, "I knew it. I knew you'd drag me into something like this." Wolfe merely said, "You may thank me later, Inspector. For now, arrest this man before he regains his dignity." And as Kramer's men hauled the intruder out into the night, Wolfe turned to me with a small, satisfied nod. "The game proceeds," he said. "And tomorrow, the truth will come knocking." By the time Kramer's men finished taking statements and the soaked intruder was escorted out into the waiting squad car, it was past midnight. The rain had turned from drizzle to steady rhythm, tapping the windows like an impatient witness. Wolfe remained at his desk, motionless, as if the chaos hadn't happened inside his own home. Kramer, on the other hand, was pacing the rug hard enough to wear a path in it. "All right, Wolfe," he barked. "You've got a man in custody, 2 letters from companies I've never heard of, and a crate full of white dust that might be sugar or might be cyanide. What in blazes am I supposed to do with this?" "Exercise patience," Wolfe said mildly, "and restraint, both of which are in short supply in your department." Kramer's jaw worked like a cement mixer. "I'll tell you what's in short supply. Evidence. I can't hold that man on breaking and entering when he didn't even manage to break anything. Unless you've got more than your word, he'll be out by noon." Wolfe's eyes flicked to the camera hidden behind the wall panel. "He will not be out by noon. You have his image, his fingerprints on the crate, and his presence here at an hour when honest men are asleep. I recommend you use them." Kramer blew out a cloud of frustration. "You're a swell one, Wolfe. You bait a trap, catch a rat, and expect me to build a case out of crumbs." "Crumbs," Wolfe murmured, "can reveal much to one who knows where they came from." I could see Kramer was 3 sentences from blowing the lid off, so I stepped in. "We've got more than crumbs, Inspector. There's a shipment manifest linking Orpheum Foods to Ainsley and March, the company Miss Karen works for. And if you check customs records, you'll find those shipments listed under sugar imports, even though the contents don't match any certified product." Kramer turned his glare on me, then back to Wolfe. "And you're sure of that?" "Archie rarely speaks without purpose," Wolfe said. "He may occasionally embellish, but seldom fabricate." I took that as the closest thing to a compliment I'd get before dawn. Kramer muttered something that sounded like a prayer with profanity in it, then grabbed his hat. "Fine. I'll have my men check the shipping records. If this turns into another one of your academic exercises, Wolfe, I'll—" "Good night, Inspector," Wolfe said, effectively ending the conversation. Kramer stomped out. When the door shut behind him, Wolfe exhaled through his nose, a rare sign of satisfaction. "Archie, the man we captured will serve his function. Once his employer learns of his arrest, the next move will come swiftly. They can no longer rely on stealth. They must rely on control." I sat down across from him. "Meaning what?" "Meaning," he said, "they will attempt negotiation or elimination, possibly both. Which do you prefer?" He gave me a look. "Neither, but we will accept the first if it leads to proof of the second." Miss Karen had been listening from the doorway. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "Mr. Wolfe, what happens now?" "You will remain here until tomorrow evening," he said. "I cannot guarantee your safety elsewhere. Your employers are desperate to silence the truth you've uncovered." She hesitated. "But if I stay, they'll know where to find me." "They already do," he said simply. "But here they will find resistance. Elsewhere, only opportunity." That didn't exactly put her at ease, but she nodded. Fritz appeared quietly and guided her to the guest room. When they were gone, I turned to Wolfe. "You really think they'll try again?" "Of course," he said. "Their investment demands it. The arrest will force their hand." He lifted his glass of beer, studied the amber light through it, then added, "Tomorrow, Archie, you will retrieve all available information on Orpheum Foods. Ownership, subsidiaries, distribution channels. The key will lie not in their imports, but in their investors." I stayed up another hour, writing out notes and timelines. The whole thing was starting to smell worse than the fake sugar. Dead inspectors, altered manifests, and a company willing to send armed men into a private home. Wolfe was right. This wasn't just greed. It was something systematic. The next morning, the sun came out reluctantly, like it didn't trust New York to behave. Wolfe was already at breakfast, corn cakes, sausages, and a mug of beer to start the day. I gave him my report from the early calls I'd made to a contact at the Commerce Department. "Orpheum Foods," I said, "is listed as a holding under 3 shell companies: Adler Group, Bright Star Imports, and a newly formed one called Nevis Trade, all out of the same Manhattan address, Suite 902, Lexington Tower." Wolfe grunted. "A hydra of convenience. Each head devours the other if the body is threatened. That will complicate prosecution." "It gets better," I said. "Ainsley and March is one of their main distribution clients. Their records show regular shipments from Orpheum every month for the past year, all marked as premium cane sugar. And here's the kicker. The tariffs are almost non-existent because of a trade exemption reserved for food donations." Wolfe's brows rose a fraction. "Charity as camouflage. Humanity never fails to disgust me." Before I could answer, the phone rang. Fritz answered and called out that a Mr. Ainsley wished to speak with Wolfe. Wolfe gestured for the receiver. "Mr. Ainsley," he said, his tone as smooth as polished steel, "I trust you are calling to offer an apology for last night's intrusion." "I'm calling," the voice on the other end said, tense and clipped, "to put an end to this nonsense. My associate tells me there's been a misunderstanding, one that's gotten out of hand. I'd prefer to resolve it privately, before the police or the press make a spectacle of it." "I am not fond of spectacles," Wolfe said, "but I am fond of truth. You may call at 11. Bring whomever you deem appropriate." A pause. "And the shipment?" "Will remain under my supervision until its nature is determined. Good morning." He hung up and looked at me. "You will, of course, ensure that our visitor does not bring more than his hat." When Ainsley arrived, he came with a man I hadn't met before. Mid-40s, expensive suit, expression like he'd never been told no. Wolfe received them without standing, as usual. Miss Karen sat to one side, silent but watchful. "Mr. Wolfe," Ainsley began, "I think we can clear this up quickly. That crate was misrouted. The compound inside is a food additive under development, perfectly legal, though not yet approved for sale. My associate, Mr. Leland, is counsel for Orpheum Foods." Leland smiled like a blade. "We appreciate your concern for public welfare, Mr. Wolfe, but you've inadvertently taken possession of proprietary material. We'd like it returned before this becomes complicated." Wolfe's eyes were half-lidded. "Mr. Leland, complications are the yeast of discovery. Without them, nothing rises." The lawyer's smile didn't waver. "Then perhaps I can make this simple with an offer. Orpheum is willing to compensate you for your inconvenience." I could almost hear the rustle of his checkbook under the table. Wolfe's tone sharpened slightly. "Do not insult me with currency, sir. The recompense I seek is transparency." "Meaning?" "Meaning," Wolfe said, "that you will produce documents verifying your claim, chemical analyses, safety certifications, trade licenses. Until then, I shall assume your product is fraudulent and your intentions worse." Leland's jaw tightened. "You're making a serious accusation." I'm making an observation, Wolfe said. The seriousness lies in your reaction. The room went still. Miss Karen's breath caught faintly. Ainsley glanced at his partner, then back to Wolfe. You're overreaching, Wolfe. You've got no proof. Not yet, Wolfe said. But by tomorrow morning, I will. The two men stood. Leland gathered his hat slowly. Then I hope, for your sake, you're wrong. When the door closed behind them, Wolfe leaned back, exhaled, and said, Archie, they will not wait until tomorrow. Kramer must have his laboratory results by evening. In the meantime, Saul will tail Mr. Leland. The truth now walks beside him. You think they'll try something again tonight? Of course, Wolfe said. A man who offers a bribe in daylight will resort to crime in the dark. He closed his eyes, and I knew what that meant. The day had turned another corner, and the game was no longer about sugar or trade or even money. It was about who would dare to cross the threshold of the brownstone again, and whether they'd walk back out. The rest of that afternoon hung heavy in the air, like a storm that couldn't make up its mind whether to break or brood. Wolfe had gone into one of his wordless thinking trances, the kind where the temperature in the office seems to drop 5 degrees and even the orchids hold their breath. I'd seen that look before, his eyes half closed, his lips moving faintly as though he was silently rearranging the world into an argument he intended to win. Miss Karen sat quietly in the corner, her posture straight but her nerves worn thin. Fritz brought her tea, though she barely touched it. At 4 o'clock, Saul Panzer called in with his report. Leland left the building at 2, he said. Took a cab to a private club on 60th. Stayed an hour, met with a man named Raymond Doss. Finance type, linked to Orpheum through shell accounts. They spoke in private, then Leland headed to the East River docks. Met another man, delivery foreman, looked tense. Something's moving tonight. Did you follow the foreman? I asked. Trying to, Saul said. He's careful, keeps checking his mirrors. Wolfe took the receiver from me. Mr. Panzer, remain in proximity but do not engage. I must know if any goods are being transferred this evening. If you observe a shipment resembling our compound, note its destination. You will be compensated for your patience. Understood, Saul said, and hung up. Wolfe turned to me. It is happening sooner than expected. They are shifting assets, perhaps to erase evidence before the authorities act. A move born of desperation, not strategy. That's good news for us, I said. Desperate men make mistakes. Indeed, he said softly, but they also grow violent. Before I could respond, the phone rang again. This time it was Kramer. His voice was brisk but edged with something that sounded almost like excitement. Wolfe, you were right. The lab results just came in. That stuff you've been sitting on isn't sugar. It's a chlorinated derivative. Industrial-grade sweetener with toxic trace compounds. It's unfit for human consumption. Anyone eating enough of it could end up with organ damage. Wolfe grunted approvingly. Then you will, of course, inform the proper agencies. I will, Kramer said, but I'd rather nail the ones distributing it. If Orpheum's behind this, I want to see the proof in writing. And Wolfe, don't go playing bait again. You've got enough enemies who'd love to shut you up. Inspector, Wolfe said with mild irritation, I have no intention of endangering myself. Archie handles that for me. I heard Kramer mutter something colorful before he hung up. Wolfe set the receiver down with a faint smile. We are near the conclusion, Archie. The truth has shape now. What remains is its unveiling. You want to bring them in again? I asked. Patience. First, confirmation. Saul must learn where they intend to move the material. Then, we prepare our invitation. I was about to comment on his choice of words when the front bell rang. 2 short buzzes, then 1 long. Fritz appeared in the doorway a moment later, uneasy. There is a man at the door, he said. He says his name is Doss. He wishes to see Mr. Wolfe. He insists it is urgent. That was fast, I thought. Either Saul's report had beaten the man to the punch, or the rat had jumped ship before the fire reached him. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. "Show him in." Raymond Doss was built like a tax return, tidy, unimpressive, and hiding more than it showed. His suit was expensive but wrinkled at the collar, and his tie had been loosened in either haste or guilt. He looked around the office as if expecting a firing squad, then settled into the red chair opposite Wolfe. "Mr. Wolfe," he began, "I know you don't know me, but I think we're on the same side." "Impossible," Wolfe said. "I have no sides, only facts. Provide some." Doss swallowed hard. "I work for the Adler Group, one of Orpheum's financiers. Or did. They're moving the remaining product out of the state tonight. They've loaded it onto a truck disguised as a sugar donation, headed for a warehouse in Hoboken. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. There's too much. Money changing hands, and too many people who'll get hurt if this keeps going." "Why come to me?" Wolfe asked. "Because," Doss said, glancing at me, "you're the only one who hasn't been bought." That earned him a raised eyebrow from Wolfe, which in our household was equivalent to applause. "And what do you seek in return for this confession?" Wolfe asked. "Protection," Doss said simply. "Once they find out I talked, I'm done. I'll testify, I'll sign anything, but I can't go to the police yet. Leland has people there. I need time." "Time," Wolfe murmured, "is a currency I dispense sparingly." He studied the man a moment longer, then said, "Very well. Archie, note the address he mentioned." I jotted it down. "Pier 42, Hoboken. Midnight shipment." Wolfe turned back to Doss. "You will remain here until further notice. If you are truthful, you are safer under this roof than anywhere else in the city." Doss nodded quickly, relief washing over his face. I didn't trust it. Something about the timing was too perfect. Wolfe must have thought the same because, after Doss was shown to the guest room, he said quietly, "Archie, see to it that our visitor does not wander. A man who arrives bearing truth so promptly may have brought deceit as well." I kept my eye on Doss while making a few phone calls. At 9, Saul checked in again. "They're loading crates now," he said. "Truck marked as World Food Relief, headed for Hoboken in an hour." "Perfect," I said. "Stay with it, but keep clear. Wolfe's cooking something." By 10, Wolfe had finished dictating a statement to Kramer, which I delivered via a secure drop. It included the address of the warehouse and the confession from Doss. Signed and dated. Wolfe always liked to make sure the dominoes were lined up before flicking the first one. At 11, Doss grew restless. "You think they'll believe me?" he asked. "If they don't," I said, "you won't have to worry about it long." He tried to laugh, but it didn't stick. 15 minutes later, I heard the faintest sound from the back of the house. A floorboard creak, quick and deliberate. I moved fast, but not fast enough. By the time I reached the corridor, the guest room door was open and Doss was gone. "Wolfe!" I shouted. From the office, his calm reply, "Yes, I expected that." "How in—" He slipped past Fritz. "Predictable," Wolfe said. "He was not seeking safety but opportunity. He intended to lead them here, or to misdirect us. The difference is academic now. We know where they are going. Kramer will be in position within the hour." "You set him up," I said. "I positioned him," Wolfe corrected. "And if I am correct, his masters will have little patience for defectors. His usefulness ends at that warehouse. And so, perhaps, will he." That was exactly what happened. At 12:43 a.m., Kramer called. His voice was hard. "Wolfe, it's done. We raided the warehouse. Found the truck, the fake sugar, and 2 dead men, Doss among them. Shot clean through the chest. The other was a dock worker. Leland's gone." Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. "Predictable, Inspector, but regrettable." "You've got your proof," Kramer said. Enough to burn Orpheum to the ground. But next time, Wolfe, warn me before you turn my night shift into a battlefield." He hung up, and the brownstone fell quiet again. The rain had stopped. Wolfe sat back, folded his hands, and said softly, "So ends the middle act. Tomorrow the stage will be crowded, with survivors and explanations." Miss Karen came into the room, pale but steady. "Is it over?" she asked. "No," Wolfe said, opening his eyes. "It is merely visible now. Tomorrow we draw the curtain and the actors will take their final bows." He poured himself another glass of beer, lifted it slightly toward the ceiling, and added, "And may the gods of appetite forgive the fools who sweeten deceit." The words hung there, rich and final, but I knew what they meant. Tomorrow, every suspect would be here again, sitting across from Wolfe's desk, facing that unblinking intellect that peeled lies like fruit. And somewhere in that careful gathering, he'd reveal which of them had tried to poison the world, and nearly succeeded. Morning came muted, with that dull gray light that belongs to October and foreboding. The house had the scent of burnt coffee and tension. Fritz moved quietly in the kitchen, more solemn than usual. He always took it personally when violence crossed the brownstone's threshold. Wolfe, of course, had slept as soundly as a hibernating bear, and by the time I came down, he was in his chair, polished and monumental, with the paper folded neatly at his elbow, but untouched. He never read until he'd absorbed the world around him first. "Archie," he said without turning his head, "any word from Mr. Panzer?" I shook my head. "Not yet. But if he's breathing, he's watching Leland. Saul doesn't lose a trail unless he means to." Wolfe's eyes shifted toward the window. "He may not have to watch much longer. Kramer will come shortly. The pieces are nearly aligned." Miss Karen appeared a few minutes later, pale but determined. She'd slept little. I'd heard her pacing after dawn, and she had the look of a woman who'd been through too many revelations in too short a time. She took her tea with both hands, like it was the only warm thing left in her life. "Mr. Wolfe," she said quietly, "you said last night the truth was visible. Does that mean you know who's responsible?" Wolfe's brow lifted slightly. "My dear Miss Karen, responsibility is a word that demands precision. Do you mean legal culpability or moral? Both are evident, though the latter is the more egregious." She gave him a puzzled look. I translated. "He means yes, but he wants to make them confess before admitting it." That earned me one of Wolfe's narrower stares, the kind that could slice butter and pride at the same time. "Archie, please contain your imprecise exuberance. I've invited certain guests this afternoon, Mr. Ainsley, Mr. Leland, and Inspector Kramer. They will arrive at 4. Until then, we remain civil. I despise chaos before lunch." That set the tone for the next few hours. I made calls, confirmed the messages were delivered, and ensured the brownstone was sealed tighter than a miser's wallet. Wolfe went to the orchards for an hour, his version of confession and prayer, then returned to the office to dictate a few notes he didn't let me read. He had that gleam again, the one I've seen right before he drops a bomb of logic that makes everyone else in the room look like they've been talking in circles. At exactly 4, the doorbell rang. Fritz ushered in the trio. Ainsley, still self-assured but showing the faint strain of a man who's realized the game might not end in his favor. Leland, crisp and glacial, carrying a thin leather briefcase. And Kramer, wearing the expression of a man who'd rather be chasing a burglar than sitting in Wolfe's parlor but knew he'd be leaving smarter than he came. Wolfe inclined his head. "Gentlemen, Miss Karen." Leland wasted no time. "Mr. Wolfe, before we begin, I'd like to know why the police are present, if this is a business matter." Kramer snorted. "You want it to be business, fine, but it's about to become criminal, so I'll stay." Wolfe interlaced his fingers and regarded them all with the serenity of a chess master who'd already seen the last move. "We are assembled to clarify certain events. A shipment, an accident, a death. each a fragment of a design that you gentlemen, I suspect, thought cleverly concealed. I find concealment tedious. So, let us dispense with it." Ainsley shifted in his seat. "You're making serious allegations, Mr. Wolfe. I'd suggest you produce evidence." "I intend to," Wolfe said. "But first, a correction. The term you used, allegations, implies uncertainty. I speak of conclusions." He gestured toward me. "Archie." I handed him a folder. Wolfe opened it with slow precision. "Inspector, here are copies of customs declarations from the past 6 months. Each lists shipments from Orpheum Foods to Ainsley and March, labeled as sugar, exempt from tariff due to charitable export. Yet analysis of the seized material confirms it to be chlorinated saccharide derivative, industrial, unfit for consumption, an intentional substitution." Leland's voice cut in smoothly. "You can't prove intent." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, "intent is written plainly in your own correspondence." He turned another page and read, "Adjust future lots under B-grade coding. Maintain invoice as cane sugar to preserve exemption. Signed, Raymond Doss, Operations." Ainsley went rigid. "That was internal shorthand. It doesn't imply wrongdoing." "No." Wolfe's voice was soft, lethal. "Then perhaps this will clarify. Doss came to me last night seeking protection. He confessed to the substitution and gave the location of the final shipment. He was murdered before the police arrived. You call that internal shorthand?" For once, Leland didn't have a reply. The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as tension concentrate. Kramer leaned forward. "You're telling me you've got signed statements?" "I am," Wolfe said. "Doss's signature, corroborated by the records Archie obtained from Ainsley and March. The motive is evident. Profit by deception, shielded under the veil of humanitarian aid." Ainsley slammed his hand on the armrest. "You're twisting this. The formula was experimental, yes, but not illegal. We were testing stability. Leland assured me." He stopped himself. Too late. Wolfe's eyes opened fully, sharp as a scalpel. "Ah. So Mr. Leland assured you. How gratifyingly careless. Inspector, it may interest you that Leland is not merely counsel for Orpheum. He is also its primary shareholder through a trust established under Bright Star Imports. Mr. Ainsley, you have been used." The color drained from Ainsley's face. Leland stood abruptly, but Kramer's hand landed heavy on his shoulder. "Sit down," he said. "You can't prove ownership," Leland hissed. "I do not need to," Wolfe replied. "The Department of Commerce will. Your arrogance has left a trail thicker than sugar syrup. Paperwork, deposits, aliases, it is all there. Your attempt to recover the crate from my home was merely desperation dressed as damage control." Leland's eyes flicked from Wolfe to Kramer to me, calculating exits and odds. None favored him. He drew in a slow breath and tried one last angle. "You can't possibly expect a jury to understand any of this. You've built a story out of assumptions and coincidence." Wolfe leaned forward slightly. "Coincidence is the refuge of the guilty, Mr. Leland. I do not rely on it. The facts suffice. You sought to flood the market with a counterfeit sweetener that would undercut legitimate sugar imports. When Miss Karen uncovered your deceit, you silenced her with dismissal and intimidation. When Doss wavered, you silenced him permanently. And when your merchandise found its way to my doorstep, you erred fatally. You presumed I would treat it as an inconvenience. I detest inconvenience. Therefore, I pursued it." Leland's composure cracked. His mouth opened, but the words collapsed halfway out. Kramer rose, slow and deliberate, and said, "That'll do. Leland, you're coming with me. Ainsley, you too. You can sort out your degrees of guilt downtown." Neither resisted. When they were gone, the room felt larger, emptier, like the air had decided it could breathe again. Miss Karen sat very still, her eyes on the folder Wolfe had closed. "So, it's finished," she said softly. Wolfe nodded. "As finished as human folly ever is. You are exonerated, Miss Karen, though I suspect you will find little comfort in it." She managed a faint smile. "Comfort's overrated. The truth's enough." When she left, the house returned to its ordinary rhythm. Fritz humming faintly, the smell of dinner drifting through the air, and Wolfe settling deeper into his chair with the satisfaction of a man whose mind had consumed a feast. I poured myself a drink. "You know," I said, "you could have just let Kramer handle it from the start. Saved us all a few grey hairs." Wolfe looked up from his beer, unimpressed. "And deprive myself of the spectacle of watching arrogance disintegrate? Hardly." He sipped, then added, "Archie, note for the record. Sweetness without honesty is poison. The world has no shortage of both." I grinned. "That, I take it, is dessert." He closed his eyes, the faintest smile forming. "No, Archie. That is digestion." And with that, the brownstone, his kingdom of logic, orchids, and order, fell quiet again, the storm outside spent, the sugar finally gone from the air. It was well past midnight when I finally convinced myself that the house was safe again. Kramer and his men had cleared out after 3 solid hours of paperwork and posturing, leaving behind the scent of wet coats and the faint satisfaction that comes when justice has at least started to stretch its legs. Wolfe had retired to his room, which meant the brownstone had officially closed its doors to the outside world. No more suspects, no more confessions, no more chemical-laced sugar. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story hadn't quite finished telling itself. Fritz had gone to bed, and the house was silent except for the rain tapping the windows. I was halfway through my nightly ritual, checking the locks and making sure no one had decided to sneak in a sequel, when I noticed something peculiar. The corner of Wolfe's desk drawer was open just a fraction, and a faint, sweet smell hung in the air. Not orchids, not beer, and not Fritz cooking. It was that same metallic sweetness that had haunted the case from the start. I pulled the drawer open. Inside, tucked under a stack of papers, was a small sealed envelope. On it, in Wolfe's unmistakably precise handwriting, were the words, "For Kramer, when he asks again." I didn't touch it. Wolfe didn't leave notes by accident, and curiosity might be my middle name, but so was employment, and I preferred to keep the latter. Still, it confirmed what I suspected. He'd solved more than he'd shared. When I went to bed, the rain had eased to a whisper. I slept lightly, the way you do when you know something's not entirely over. And sure enough, at 8 the next morning, the phone dragged me out of it. "Goodwin," I muttered. "Archie, this is Saul," came the voice, low and steady as always. "Something you'll want to hear. Leland's singing, but the tune's off-key. He's naming others, claims Orpheum had partners overseas. He says the compound was only one part of a larger operation. They were planning to blend it with legitimate sugar, distribute it under multiple labels. Quiet, long-term profits, poison in teaspoons." That woke me up faster than coffee ever could. "And Kramer believes him." "Not yet," Saul said. "But he's listening. Figured you'd want Wolfe to know." I thanked him, hung up, and went straight to Wolfe's room. He hates interruptions before 9, but this wasn't about breakfast etiquette. He was already awake, sitting in his robe like a Roman senator waiting for the empire to report in. When I told him what Saul said, he didn't blink. "I expected as much," he said finally. "A network that extensive does not disintegrate at one arrest. Evil seldom functions alone. It requires partners, patrons, and fools. We have removed the fools. The rest will scurry soon enough." "So what do we do?" I asked. He yawned slightly. "Nothing. Not yet. Let Kramer play his part. He will turn stones out of duty. We turn them out of curiosity. If more serpents slither forth, we shall identify them. He stood then, which meant the day was officially in motion. Archie, notify Mr. Panzer that I wish to see him at 10, and prepare Miss Karen's statement for the district attorney. She should have her piece properly documented. By the time Saul arrived, Fritz had revived the morning with eggs, biscuits, and a kind of quiet pride that only comes from seeing the master satisfied. Wolfe ate methodically, listening as Saul delivered his findings. I tailed one of Leland's former clerks, Saul said. Kid named Ferris. Last night, after the arrests, he went straight to an address on East 78th. Belongs to a Mr. Victor Harlow, international trader. Never involved directly with Orpheum on paper, but his shipping company, East Line Logistics, handled over half their exports. Harlow's been nervous. Sent 2 messages overseas after midnight. One to Rotterdam, one to Belize. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. Belize, he said softly. A convenient harbor for inconvenient commerce. Saul nodded. I figured as much. Thought you'd want to know. I do, Wolfe said. Archie, we will require a copy of those shipping manifests, and locate this Mr. Harlow. I prefer to question him before the inspector blunders through the door and alerts him to his peril. Where do I find him? At his club, Wolfe said without hesitation. Men of his type cling to habit as if it were salvation. He will not change his routine because the walls tremble. Saul left to make arrangements, and I headed uptown. The club was one of those marble-faced sanctuaries where money pretends to be virtue. Harlow was there, all right, corner table, scotch at hand, pretending to read the Financial Times, but glancing at the door every 10 seconds. He was the kind of man who'd been born with confidence and acquired conscience later, reluctantly. I walked up, gave him the smile that usually works better than a badge, and said, Mr. Harlow, Nero Wolfe sent me. You've been expecting us. He looked up sharply. I don't know any Mr. Wolfe. Then it's high time you met him, I said, and sat down before he could object. We can do this here, or in his office. Personally, I recommend the office. The chairs are more forgiving. He hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. What does he want? Your cooperation and your honesty, in either order. By the time I walked him back to the brownstone, his Scotch courage had worn off. Wolfe greeted him without ceremony, gesturing toward the red chair that had already hosted the guilty and the merely unlucky. Mr. Harlow, Wolfe began, you facilitated shipments for Orpheum Foods under the guise of charitable distribution. You may claim ignorance, but ignorance in your position is either implausible or criminal. Which would you prefer to confess to? Harlow's fingers twitched on the armrest. I handled logistics. That's all. I didn't know what was in the shipments. Yet, Wolfe said, you authorized documentation listing industrial chemicals as sugar. That suggests you knew enough to falsify the record. Enlighten me. Did you imagine this fraud would remain unnoticed forever, or were you counting on purchasing silence indefinitely? Harlow swallowed hard. You don't understand. This wasn't just my doing. The compound, Orpheum didn't invent it, they bought it. There's another company behind it. European. They funded the research. Orpheum was just the distributor. Wolfe's eyes half closed, the way they do when a thought clicks into place. Names. Velden Chemicalian, Harlow said. They operate out of Rotterdam. Leland met with them twice this year. Their people handled the shipments until it reached U.S. ports. We took over from there. Do you have proof? In my office. Contracts, correspondence, copies. But if they know I've talked, they will know, Wolfe said simply. But they will not reach you before the authorities do. Archie, contact Inspector Kramer. Inform him that Orpheum Foods was merely a branch of a larger route, one that reaches beyond jurisdiction. Kramer arrived an hour later, and by the look on his face, I knew this was going to mean more late nights and headlines. You're telling me this goes international, he said. You had to pick a case that drags in half the Atlantic trade system? Not I, Wolfe said. They selected me, by intrusion and by arrogance. I merely responded. Kramer grunted. Yeah, well, your response just earned me a diplomatic migraine. We'll have to coordinate with Interpol on this Veldon outfit. That will be your pleasure, Wolfe said. Mine ends here. And it did. The following days unfolded like the slow closing of a trap. Harlow turned over his documents. The papers confirmed everything. Contracts masked under charity fronts, coded transfers, even Leland's signature on a joint venture agreement. Within a week, arrests rippled from New York to Rotterdam. Kramer got his headlines. Wolfe got his quiet. When the last report was printed and the house returned to its old rhythm, Wolfe called me into the office. He was at his desk, surrounded by peace. Orchids, books, and the faint hum of order restored. Archie, he said, I detest sweetness when it offends intelligence, yet humanity insists upon it, in food, in speech, even in deceit. They flavor their lies to make them easier to swallow. It is a pernicious habit. I grinned. You think the world should go sugarless? He gave me a look. No, but it should learn to tell the difference between sugar and poison. He reached for his beer, settled back in the chair, and closed his eyes. That will be all for today, Archie. The case is finished. Dinner, I trust, will not be. And that was Nero Wolfe's way of saying the world could crumble again tomorrow, but tonight the brownstone was whole. Justice had been served, and the only sweetness left in the house was Fritz's custard, which for once didn't taste the least bit bitter. It was 2 days later when the brownstone, against its usual law of serenity, found itself once again disturbed. The newspaper had already moved on to fresher scandals. Kramer's men and the international arrests had made the front page, and Wolfe's name, thankfully, had not. Wolfe considered that the only acceptable outcome. He'd been in unusually fine spirits ever since, which for him meant he'd resumed his routine of silence at breakfast and short, acerbic comments at dinner. Fritz took it as a sign that the world had righted itself. I wasn't so sure. You can usually tell when a case has settled too neatly. The quiet has edges, and Wolfe, though satisfied, hadn't yet made one of his little philosophical remarks that usually close a case like the final note in a symphony. That meant the last chord hadn't been played. At noon that Thursday, I was typing up my final report for the files when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. It was lunchtime, and you risk Wolfe's wrath by letting the outside world interrupt Fritz's timing, but the instinct that's kept me alive more than once said otherwise. The voice on the line was unfamiliar, but urgent. Mr. Goodwin, this is Inspector Kramer's office. The inspector's been trying to reach Mr. Wolfe. Tell him we've had an incident. What kind of incident? Explosion. Small but deliberate. Warehouse in Hoboken, the one where the Orpheum shipments were stored. Fire department says traces of accelerant. The lab's calling it sabotage. That did it. The neat bow Wolfe had tied around the case just came undone. I carried the news into the office. Wolfe was in his chair, of course, with a copy of Theodore Dreiser open on his lap and a beer sweating quietly on the desk. He didn't look up when I entered. Archie, he said, it is noon. I assume the call is not about lunch. No, I said. Kramer just called. The Hoboken warehouse went up last night. Explosion, deliberate. Someone wanted the rest of Orpheum's evidence gone. That got him to close the book, which, in Wolfe's world, was equivalent to a panic alarm. His eyes opened, and for the first time since the arrests, I saw the faintest ripple of genuine irritation. Fools, he muttered. They mistake obliteration for erasure. You think Leland's people did it? He shook his head slowly. Leland is in custody, as are his immediate accomplices. This reeks of preservation, not desperation. There is someone above or behind who has not yet been seen. And you think they're still out there? He frowned. Archie, in commerce as in nature, one rarely encounters an orphaned enterprise. There's always a progenitor, a financier, a benefactor, a mind content to let others handle the mud while it collects the gold. I leaned against the desk. Then I'll assume you're not going to let Kramer take this one without a fight. Kramer, Wolfe said, has the authority to close a case. I have the obligation to complete it. He rang the bell for Fritz. Lunch will wait. Bring coffee. Archie, call Saul Panzer. Inform him that his services are again required. By 2 o'clock, Saul was seated across from me, hat on his knee, expression attentive. Wolfe explained in his usual economical way. The Hoboken warehouse was destroyed. I want to know who ordered it, who executed it, and who benefits from its absence. Begin with financial records, insurance, holdings, recent transfers. A fire is never so simple as a match. Saul nodded. Understood. Report tonight, Wolfe said. When Saul left, I turned to him. You think whoever lit that fuse is still working the same racket? Undoubtedly. A profitable corruption seldom dies willingly. The destruction of the warehouse was not revenge, it was cleansing. Cleansing of what? Evidence, he said. Or conscience, though that is unlikely. That evening, Saul's report came in like a gust through a half-open window. I checked the ownership, he said over the phone. Warehouse was insured through Eastline Holdings, Harlow's company. Policy activated 2 days ago, big payout clause. But here's the kicker. The insurer is a shell under another name, Veldon Chemicalian's American subsidiary. I didn't have to repeat that to Wolfe. I just said the name Veldon, and he grunted in disgust. Predictable, he said. The European partner merely concluded its investment with efficiency. They believe the chain severed. Are they wrong? Utterly. Kramer will not close this file until the smoke clears, and I, Archie, intend to thicken that smoke for them until they choke on it. That was how we found ourselves hosting one final guest in the brown stone. At 10 the next morning, a courier arrived with a parcel addressed not to Wolfe, but to the estate of Orpheum Foods. No return address, but postmarked Rotterdam. Fritz handed it to me as though it might explode. I put it on Wolfe's desk. He studied it for a long moment. Archie, the irony of human folly never ceases. They continue to use my address as the conduit of their schemes. You going to open it? I'm not, he said. You are. Gee, thanks. Carefully, he added, and not in this room. If it is innocuous, bring it back. If it is not, call Kramer. I took it to the basement and opened it with gloves. Inside was no bomb, just a ledger. Old, bound in leather, the pages covered in cramped European handwriting. The entries were shipments, dates, initials. But every few pages had one recurring symbol in the margin, a black X over a circle. When I brought it back up, Wolfe didn't touch it. He only nodded. The mark of Veldon's export division, their code for goods of sensitive nature. That ledger is the spine of their operation. It contains every transaction, every client, and, if we are fortunate, their benefactor. It took hours, but by evening, Wolfe had translated enough of it to find what he wanted. Here, he said, tapping a page. Note the entry for March 15th. The shipment number matches that of our original crate. And here, payment received from HF Consolidated. I frowned. Never heard of it. Nor had I, he said, until last year, when a minor news item reported a merger, HF Consolidated acquiring a controlling stake in Veldon Chemicalian. Headquarters, Brussels. Meaning our mastermind's in Belgium now. Precisely, and I suspect quite comfortable. I whistled low. That's a long reach even for Kramer. Yes, Wolfe said, which is why it will not be Kramer's reach. It will be mine. That evening he dictated a letter to the Belgian consulate, formal, precise, and sharp enough to draw blood. It outlined the evidence, the ledger, and the connection to Veldon's exports. He sent it through diplomatic channels. Then, for the first time in a week, he seemed truly content. When the letter was sealed and the beer poured, he leaned back and closed his eyes. "Archie," he said, "I do not delude myself that justice is complete. It never is. But every now and then one may strike sufficiently close to the heart of corruption that it bleeds, even across borders. And if they don't answer your letter," he opened his eyes, "then they will know that I am watching. That is, at times, the sharper deterrent." The next morning's mail brought nothing, and the day settled into its ordinary rhythm. Wolfe returned to his orchids, Fritz to his kitchen, and I to my desk. The brownstone exhaled peace again, tentative but real. Late that afternoon, as the last of the sunlight filtered through the office window, a telegram arrived. It was unsigned but bore the Belgian seal. One line only. "Velden Chemicalian dissolved under government order. Gratitude for your assistance." I handed it to Wolfe. He read it once, folded it neatly, and slipped it into the drawer beside the envelope marked for Kramer. "Archie," he said, "this is what passes for victory in an imperfect world. We shall accept it." "Not a bad ending," I said. He closed his eyes again. "On the contrary, it is ideal. The guilty undone by their own sweetness." Dinner that night was perfect. Fritz had outdone himself with roasted duck and wine. Wolfe ate in silence, eyes half closed in satisfaction. When we finished, he leaned back, hands folded on his stomach, and said, "Archie, you may record this as conclusion. The world remains corrupt, but dinner is still worth having. Therein lies our consolation." I smiled, poured him another beer, and for the first time in days, the brownstone felt exactly as it should, untroubled, impenetrable, and just a little smug. Outside, the city went on humming its careless tune, but inside, Nero Wolfe's world was whole again, the sugar no longer sweet, and justice, at least for now, served hot. The telegram lay on Wolfe's desk for 3 days before he bothered to move it. He didn't throw it away, mind you. He simply allowed it to rest there like a final period at the end of a sentence he had already read 3 times. Every now and then I'd catch him glance at it, the faintest flicker of a thought behind that immovable expression. For Wolfe, that was the equivalent of someone pacing the room. By the 4th day, the house had regained its sacred rhythm. Fritz was back to experimenting with sauces that would make kings weep. Wolfe was buried in his orchids for 4-hour stretches, and I had nearly convinced myself that the world had decided to behave. That illusion lasted until precisely 3:47 that afternoon, when the doorbell rang. Fritz answered, then appeared at the office doorway looking faintly perplexed. "A man wishes to see you, Mr. Wolfe. He says he is from Brussels." That got Wolfe's head up. "Indeed," he murmured. "Show him in." The visitor was tall, spare, and impeccably dressed in a grey suit that looked pressed by geometry itself. He carried no briefcase, just a slim envelope, and introduced himself with a slight European accent. "Monsieur Wolfe, my name is André Morel. I'm attached to the Belgian embassy." Wolfe inclined his head. "Attached by duty or discretion?" Morel smiled faintly. "Both. I come bearing gratitude and a request." "Two dangerous combinations," Wolfe said. "Proceed." Morel handed over the envelope. Wolfe opened it and read the letter inside, in silence. It bore official letterhead, and I could see the red wax seal of the Belgian Ministry of Trade. Whatever it said, it made Wolfe's brows rise by an infinitesimal but definite fraction. When he finished, he folded the paper and set it beside the telegram. "So," he said quietly, "Velden Chemicalian may be dissolved, but the serpent sheds its skin abroad." Morel nodded. "The investigation you prompted has unearthed considerable corruption. However, one of the company's former directors, a man named Henri Falk, has vanished. He was responsible for financial oversight, payments, transfers, and accounts linked to several American concerns. Our government believes he is in New York. And you wish me to find him? Wolfe asked. To confirm his presence, Morell said. And, if possible, to persuade him to return voluntarily. Extradition is politically delicate. Wolfe's gaze shifted to me. Archie, it appears that tranquility is a luxury once more postponed. I shrugged. Wouldn't know what to do with tranquility anyway. Morell looked between us with the faintest trace of amusement. We understand your terms, Mr. Wolfe. You will, of course, be compensated. Wolfe waved that away. Compensation is inevitable. What interests me is principle. I detest unfinished work, and Mr. Falk seems to represent the residue of it. When Morell departed, Wolfe leaned back, eyes half closed, and said, Archie, this man Falk, find him. Just like that. The city's got 9 million people. Yes, Wolfe said calmly, but only a few of them have the manners, money, and stupidity to flee from Belgium and still dine at decent restaurants. Begin with the Waldorf, then the Pierre. If he has taste, he will seek comfort. I spent the next day chasing down hotel registries. By the time the evening rush began, I'd found a Henriette listed at the Pierre, registered 2 days earlier, paid in cash. The clerk remembered him well. French accent, discreet, the sort of man who tipped too precisely to be honest. I called Wolfe from the lobby phone. Got him. Room 904, checked in alone, goes out at odd hours, and has a steady stream of mail. None local. Good, Wolfe said. Observe, but do not confront. I will arrange the rest. That meant Saul Panzer was about to earn another payday. By morning, Saul had eyes on Falk's movements. Morning strolls in Central Park, long lunches at Le Tréport on Madison, evening phone calls from a public booth near the hotel. The man had a pattern, and Wolfe was patient enough to wait for it to close in on itself. On the third day, it did. Falk met someone in the park, a woman, tall, dark hair, carrying a pale blue handbag. Saul followed them to a cafe. They spoke for 30 minutes, then parted. Falk left first. The woman stayed behind long enough to destroy a piece of paper in her coffee saucer before leaving. When Saul reported that, Wolfe said simply, Archie, bring Mr. Falk to me. How? Any method that does not involve bloodshed or embarrassment. Preferably. So that evening I positioned myself in the hotel bar. Falk arrived right on schedule, immaculate, cautious, and with the kind of nerves that never quite leave a man who's been running too long. I struck up a conversation under the pretense of sharing a bartender. When I mentioned the name Orpheum, he froze just long enough to confirm everything. He followed me back to the brownstone without a word. Wolfe greeted him as though they were old adversaries. Mr. Falk, it is kind of you to conclude this tangle in person. The Belgians have been most anxious for your company. Falk's accent was smooth but brittle. I am not returning to Belgium. I had no part in Velden's missteps. I merely facilitated their accounts. Indeed, Wolfe said. And yet you fled before anyone accused you. That is inconveniently suggestive. They would have made me a scapegoat. Then confess your innocence publicly, Wolfe said. Hiding invites pursuit. Falk's composure wavered. I cannot. There are others, private investors, powerful men. They would see me dead before I spoke. That caught my attention. You saying there's another layer to this thing? Falk nodded slowly. Velden was the shell, but the real money came from a consortium. They wanted to corner the artificial sweetener market, replace sugar globally, control supply, dictate price. The compound was never about cheap fraud. It was about monopoly. Velden was expendable. I was expendable. They won't stop. Wolfe's fingers steepled. And who leads this consortium? I don't know, Falk said quietly. They keep it sealed. Code names, intermediaries. But I know one thing. They called the project Ambrosia. The documents are in a safety deposit box at the Gotham Trust. Wolfe's eyes opened. Archie, make inquiries discreetly. We must confirm the existence of this deposit before our guest succumbs to selective memory. Falk stood abruptly. I've told you all I can. If they know I'm here. They already know, Wolfe said calmly. They always do. That night, Saul confirmed that Falk's hotel room had been searched, his luggage overturned, and a plain black car had been idling outside for hours. Whoever these investors were, they weren't wasting time. Wolfe ordered Falk to remain at the brownstone overnight. Fritz was none too pleased about hosting another frightened fugitive, but orders were orders. At dawn, the inevitable came. A car parked across the street. 2 men waited inside, watching the house. Wolfe didn't bother to look. He simply said, Archie, inform Kramer that his foreign guests are about to overstay their welcome. Kramer's men arrived within the hour, and the watchers disappeared like smoke. But Wolfe was right. They wouldn't stop. When I returned to the office, he was already dictating a letter. To the Ministry of Trade, he said, we shall send Falk home under escort. It is not justice to keep him here as bait. He sealed the letter, then looked at me. Archie, remember this. Corruption has no nationality. It moves with capital, not conscience. Today, Belgium, tomorrow, New York. The substance may change, but the taste remains bitter. That evening, as the embassy car took Falk away under protection, Wolfe sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he said, Archie, the case is closed. Again. But if the world insists on breeding such sweetness, we may expect to be disturbed yet again. I grinned. Then I'll make sure Fritz keeps the coffee strong. Wolfe's eyes closed. Content. Do. For men like us, Archie, bitterness is the only true preservative. And with that, the brownstone settled once more into its familiar peace, temporary, fragile, and utterly complete, until the next disruption came knocking at its door. The following evening, the brownstone was quieter than a church after vespers. The city beyond the windows hummed faintly, but inside, all was still except for the faint clink of Fritz in the kitchen and the deep, measured creak of Wolfe's chair. The storm that had brewed for days, legal, moral, and otherwise, had finally broken, and what remained was that strange silence that follows when men have run out of lies. Falk had been delivered into official hands that afternoon, escorted by embassy staff and an unusually polite pair of Kramer's detectives. He hadn't looked back when he left, though I caught the briefest flicker in his eyes. The haunted awareness of a man who tried to play both sides and finally realized there were no winners. Wolfe had watched from his chair without moving, and when the door closed, he'd simply said, He will live long enough to give useful testimony. That will suffice. Now, as I sat across from him with a fresh notebook and a glass of rye, the house seemed to exhale relief. The orchids upstairs would have been breathing easier too if they had lungs. You're satisfied then? I asked. He didn't answer at first. His gaze rested on the faint curl of steam rising from his beer, as though he were considering whether to commend it or indict it. Satisfaction, he said finally, is an overrated condition. One is either hungry or ill. Occasionally, one is both. That's your way of saying you're pleased with yourself, I said. Pfui, he murmured. The world remains unaltered. Only a few men have been rearranged into their proper categories. He paused, then added, But yes, I am pleased, mildly, that justice has at least brushed the sleeve of those who mistook cleverness for cunning. That is rare. He gestured toward the envelope on his desk, the one marked for Kramer when he asks again. It was still unopened. I'd stopped wondering what was inside, partly because I knew he'd never tell me, and partly because I'd learned long ago that curiosity around Wolfe was a contact sport. "What happens now?" I asked. "No more Belgians, no more sugar, no more poisoned philanthropy." "For the moment," he said, "but corruption, like fermentation, is a natural process. It resumes when unattended. You planning to attend it?" "Not tonight." That, coming from Wolfe, was practically a vacation notice. He reached for the bell cord, and a moment later, Fritz entered, his timing as exact as if the air itself had warned him. Dinner arrived: roast duck, braised endive, and something involving chestnuts that I couldn't pronounce but didn't intend to criticize. Wolfe examined the plate with approval, the kind of reverence he reserved for cuisine and deduction. "Fritz," he said, "the world could survive without virtue, but not without dinner. You are the proof." When Fritz beamed his thanks and retreated, Wolfe turned back to me. "Archie, record for posterity. The Orpheum affair confirms yet again that human appetite is the root of both progress and perdition. Men adulterate sugar for profit, language for deception, and conscience for convenience. What they cannot counterfeit is integrity. It has no substitute compound." "That's one for Bartlett's," I said. "You done sermonizing, or should I pour more beer?" He ignored that. "Miss Karen will return to her profession with her name restored, perhaps even ennobled by scandal. Mr. Ainsley will cooperate to save himself from imprisonment, though not from contempt. Kramer will claim victory, as is his custom, though he knows better. And we, Archie, we will dine. That at least is constant." He picked up his knife and fork, cutting with deliberate precision. "You, however," he added, "might consider avoiding sugar for some time, even the legitimate variety. After this week, I'd rather take my sweetness in small doses," I said. He made a low, approving noise, the Wolfe equivalent of laughter, and for a while the only sound in the room was the quiet rhythm of forks and knives, the ticking of the clock, and the faint murmur of the world outside continuing its noisy business of being imperfect. When dinner ended, he pushed his plate away, dabbed his mouth with his napkin, and leaned back with that look of postprandial divinity that only Wolfe could pull off. "Archie," he said, "I believe I've earned the indulgence of rest." "Sure," I said, standing. "I'll tell Kramer to hold all future crimes until you're refreshed." "That would be considerate," he said, eyes already closed. As I turned out the light, the office felt larger somehow, the air cleaner. The ledger, the crates, the threats, all of it had dissolved into memory, leaving only the scent of orchids and the faint sweetness that still lingered in the hall. Outside, New York was humming again, indifferent as ever. Inside, Nero Wolfe had restored his small corner of order, and I had the distinct, comforting sense that somewhere in the chaos of human appetites, reason had won, if only by an inch. And if that inch happened to run straight through a kitchen, a ledger, and one very large detective who refused to move for anyone but the truth, well, that was the sweet part. I switched off the last light, leaving him dozing in his chair, his beer half finished beside him. For all the poison and deceit we'd sifted through, the brownstone stood unshaken, the world outside be damned. Dinner was done, justice was fed, and Nero Wolfe, immovable, indomitable, and utterly content, had once again proven that the mind, when properly exercised, can be the most satisfying meal of all. 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 Satisfying meal of all.